Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
The morning Alina Hartwell decided to fight back began like any other, with the smell of coffee she hadn't made. She stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, the kitchen where she had baked birthday cakes for 30 years, where she had cried over spilled milk and laughed over burnt toast, and watched her daughter-in-law Melissa move through the space like she owned it. Which Alina supposed was precisely the point. I moved the mugs, Melissa said without turning around. The old placement made no sense. You had them too far from the machine. Leaner pressed her lips together. I've had them in that cabinet for 22 years. Exactly. Melissa finally turned, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Way too long to be doing something inefficient. This was how it had been for 6 months, ever since her son Daniel and Melissa had moved in temporarily after their downtown apartment lease ended. Temporarily had a way of becoming permanent when you stopped fighting it one small battle at a time. The mugs had been moved, the furniture had been rearranged. The garden Alina had tended since Daniel was in diapers had been declared overgrown and honestly kind of sad by Melissa, who had then hired a landscaper without asking. Alina had said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. She had been raised in a generation that confused silence with grace, but the cottage, that was different. The cottage sat at the far edge of Alina's 2-acre property, a small stone building her late husband Robert had restored with his own hands over the course of 3 summers. It had one bedroom, a fireplace, a writing desk by the window that looked out over the old oak tree. Robert had called it his thinking house. After he died, Alina had called it her sanctuary. She would go there on Sunday mornings with a book and a thermos of tea and feel for a few hours that the world was still the size it had been when he was alive. She had never rented it out, never let the grandchildren use it as a playhouse. It was the one space she kept entirely, selfishly, wholly for herself, which made it exactly the kind of thing Melissa had been eyeing since the day she arrived. It's just sitting there, Melissa said one evening at dinner in the tone she used when she had already decided something and was simply narrating the outcome. Daniel and I were thinking it would make a perfect home office. For both of us, we could knock through the back wall, add a proper bathroom. There's already a bathroom, Alina said, a proper one with a double vanity. Melissa reached across the table for the bread basket. It makes more sense than leaving it empty. Robert would have wanted it used. Alina set down her fork very carefully. It was the invocation of Robert that did it. The casual deployment of her dead husband as an argument, as if Melissa had known him, as if she had any idea what Robert would have wanted. Robert, who had spent 3 summers laying those stones by hand. Robert, who had carved their initials into the wooden beam above the door when he finished, who had poured 2 glasses of champagne and said, "This one is just ours, Ellie. Nobody else's." Think about it, Alina said, but she was already thinking about something else entirely. The next morning, Alina drove to see her attorney. Patricia Oakes had been Alina's lawyer for 15 years, handling everything from Robert's estate to a boundary dispute with a neighbor in 2019. She was a small, precise woman who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the quiet authority of someone who had seen every variety of human foolishness. I want to sell the cottage, Alina said. Separately from the main house, can it be done? Patricia looked at her over her glasses. The cottage has its own foundation, its own utilities hookup, sits on a quarter acre that's technically described as a separate parcel in the original deed. Robert was thorough, she paused. You've had an offer before the Andersons 3 years ago. They moved away. There will be others. What's your timeline? Alina thought of Melissa's smile, of the moved mugs, of Robert would have wanted it used. Fast, she said. She listed it quietly, no signs on the lawn, nothing on the major public sites. Patricia knew a local buyer's agent named James who specialized in what he called discreet transactions, which Alina understood to mean sales conducted without drama. Within 10 days there was an offer. Within 3 weeks there was a closing date. Alina told no one this was, she understood, a choice with consequences. Daniel was her son. She loved him with the uncomplicated ferocity that mothers carry for their children regardless of what those children become as adults. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had slowly, over the course of a 7-year marriage, learned to see the world through his wife's eyes so completely that he had nearly stopped using his own. He would be upset. She had made her peace with that. What she had not anticipated was closing day falling on a Thursday, and Melissa happening to be working from home, and the buyer, a young writer named Thomas Chen who had nearly wept when he saw the desk by the window, arriving with his moving truck at 11 in the morning while Alina was standing in the driveway to greet him. Melissa came out of the main house still holding her laptop, wearing the expression of someone who has encountered a fact that refuses to cooperate with her narrative. What is this? She asked. Thomas is moving in, Alina said pleasantly. He's a novelist. I think he'll love the light in the mornings. Melissa stared at the moving truck, stared at Thomas who was directing 2 movers carrying a bookshelf, stared at Alina. You sold it. I did, you without telling us you just. Melissa's voice climbed in a way Alina had never heard before, stripped of its usual managed composure. We had plans for that space. We talked about it at dinner. You said you'd think about it. I thought about it. Daniel is going to. Daniel is my son, Alina said still pleasantly, and the cottage was my property, solely mine in my name on its own parcel. I'm sure Patricia can explain the deed structure if that would help. Pleasantness was not cruelty. Alina wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was not taking pleasure in Melissa's shock. She was simply done performing helplessness in her own home. Melissa took a step forward. Her voice dropped to something harder, something Alina suspected was closer to her actual register. "This is our house now," she said. "You invited us here, you made us feel like this was a place we could build a life, and then you went around us like we're nobody, like we don't matter." Alina was quiet for a moment. Around them the movers carried boxes. Thomas Chen disappeared through the cottage door. "You matter," Alina said finally. "Daniel matters enormously to me." "But you made a mistake, Melissa. You confused my kindness for surrender. You moved my mugs and redesigned my garden and told me what my late husband would have wanted in the same breath that you were planning to gut the one space he built with his hands." She paused. "That was a mistake." Melissa opened her mouth, closed it. "The main house is still mine," Alina continued. "You're still welcome here. I meant that when I said it, and I mean it now. But the terms have changed. I think it might be worth sitting down, all three of us, and talking about what this arrangement actually looks like going forward." She turned and walked back inside. Daniel came home at 6. Alina heard the conversation from upstairs, not the words, just the shape of them, the rising and falling, the long silences that meant Melissa was presenting her case and Daniel was trying to absorb it. She sat in the chair by her bedroom window with a book she wasn't reading and waited. He knocked on her door at 7. He looked like his father in that moment, which was not always true but was true when he was troubled. The same vertical line between his brows, the same way he stood with one hand on the doorframe as though the architecture could anchor him. "Mom, in, sweetheart." He sat on the edge of the bed. He was 41 years old, and in this light he was also 11, also 17, also 24, and bringing Melissa home for the first time. "You could have told me," he said. "I could have," Alina agreed. "Would it have made a difference?" He was quiet long enough that she had her answer. "She's not wrong that we had plans. They were never your plans to have, Daniel." She said it gently, but she said it. "I never agreed. I said I'd think about it. And when I thought about it, I thought about your father spending 3 summers on those stones, and I thought about the way Melissa brought him up like a trump card, and I thought, no, this one stays mine. She's my wife. I know she is. And I love you for loving her, but you've been so busy seeing through her eyes that you forgot I have eyes too. I've been watching you disappear into this marriage, Dan, not in the way people mean when they say that, not romantically. I mean, I've watched your judgment go quiet. I've watched you stop noticing when someone else's comfort is costing you something." He looked at his hands. "I'm not your enemy," Alina said. "Neither is Melissa, truly. But someone needed to draw a line, and since I was the only one who seemed inclined to draw it, I did, by selling the cottage out from under us. Selling my property, yes." Another silence. Outside, the lights in the cottage glowed warmly. Thomas Chen, already installed at the desk by the window, doing exactly what the desk was meant for. "Where does that leave us?" Daniel asked. "Living here, I mean." "That depends," Alina said, "on whether we can have an honest conversation. Not tonight. But soon." She paused. "I've already spoken to a contractor about converting the sunroom into a proper guest suite. Private entrance. You and Melissa would have your own space. But there would be an agreement written, if you like, about what's shared and what isn't." He looked up. "You planned this." "I planned for the possibility that we'd need new terms, yes." "How long?" She almost smiled. "Since the mugs." The conversation with all three of them happened on a Saturday morning 10 days later. Lena had made coffee in her mugs back in their original cabinet and set out the kind of breakfast spread she reserved for important occasions. Melissa came in looking prepared for battle and found a table laid with care which seemed to confuse her more than confrontation would have. Lena had written 3 pages of notes and brought none of them. She had decided to trust herself. "I want to say something first," Melissa said before Lena could begin. She paused, seeming to decide something. "I've been treating this like a negotiation since we got here, like there was something to be won. My therapist says I do that." A brief, uncomfortable laugh. "I think I was scared of feeling like a guest forever, so I tried to stop feeling like one by taking up more space than I was given." Lena hadn't expected that. She held it carefully, the way you hold an unexpectedly fragile thing. "I understand that," she said. "I've been a guest in spaces before and I know that feeling. But Melissa, this is my home, not a way station, my home, and you're welcome in it if we can agree on what that means." They talked for 2 hours. It was uncomfortable in the way that honest conversations are always uncomfortable, not cruel, just unpadded. Daniel said things he'd been swallowing for months. Alina said things she'd been polishing into silence. Melissa, to her genuine credit, listened more than she spoke for the second hour, which Alina suspected was not her natural inclination. By the end, there was no perfect resolution. There was something better, an understanding that the situation had been unspoken and that unspoken things fester, and that all three of them preferred, when pressed, to live in a house with honest air. 3 months later, the sunroom conversion was complete. It was a small, sweet bedroom sitting area, a kitchenette barely bigger than a closet, but it had its own entrance from the garden, and Melissa had chosen the paint color and the fixtures, and that seemed to matter in ways Alina hadn't predicted. Thomas Chen, the writer, proved to be a quiet and considerate neighbor. He waved from his window in the mornings. He left a copy of his first novel in Alina's mailbox when it was published, with an inscription that read, "To Alina, who trusted a stranger with something sacred. I'll try to deserve it." Alina cried a little when she read that. She did it in the kitchen, privately, with a cup of tea in Robert's favorite mug, the chipped blue one that had never been moved, not once in 22 years. She thought sometimes about what people meant when they talked about being a certain age and becoming invisible, and she thought they had it partially right but crucially wrong. You did become invisible, but only to the people who had decided without asking what you were: a background figure, a resource, a soft yes waiting to be spoken, the ones who had decided that were never going to see you clearly no matter how loudly you spoke. So you didn't speak loudly, you simply acted. You drove to your attorney. You listed the property quietly. You stood in your driveway on a Thursday morning and watched a young writer carry his books into a stone cottage and felt, moving through you like water, the uncomplicated satisfaction of a woman who had finally, at 67, learned to treat her own no as complete sentence, requiring no explanation, no apology, no committee vote. The cottage was gone. But the space it had occupied in Alina's chest, the space she'd allowed to become contested territory, was hers again. She poured the rest of her coffee down the sink. She had things to do, she always had things to do.